A while back, my girlfriend, another couple, and I spent a day on the beach along the Davidson River and had a very odd experience. We had discovered this spot the day before, and three of us spent the day relaxing while one friend went up the river about 500 yards around a bend. When he returned, he mentioned hearing a weird noise. We brushed it off and continued our day without incident. The next day, we returned to find the beach surprisingly crowded. By around 3 p.m., the place emptied out, and we were alone until about 5 p.m. As we began to pack the car, which was about 50 yards away, the friend who had heard the noise and I went back to the beach for the last two items. We had been unsuccessfully skipping rocks all day and decided to give it one last try. After a couple of throws, my friend suddenly managed to skip his rock an impressive 40 yards, bouncing 50 times. Before we could react, we heard an extremely loud vibrational noise, reminiscent of the buzzing from an improperly plugged-in guitar amp. The sound was so intense that we could feel it in our chests, growing closer like a helicopter about to fly over us on the riverbank. Just as it seemed it would come into view, it veered off and seemed to head towards where our car was parked and up towards a mountain. The noise abruptly stopped, and we exchanged bewildered glances. My friend remarked, "That was weird, but it's going to be even weirder if the girls didn't hear it." When we returned to the car, they were both inside, annoyed and asking what took so long. To our astonishment, they hadn't heard a thing. When we asked how long they thought we'd been gone, they said at least 45 minutes. In reality, it felt like no more than 5 to 7 minutes had passed for us. I've spent at least 40 days at this river spot and have never experienced or heard of anything similar happening there. It was a random day when my family and I planned a trip to Dahalan Bukidnon Park in the Philippines. Using a GPS tracker to guide us, we set off, unaware that the GPS might not be accurate. We followed the route as directed. My uncle was driving our large, family-sized car. As we journeyed, the sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the tall trees surrounding us. I fell asleep, exhausted from the trip, but was jolted awake by my mother's voice urgently warning in Cebuano, "Dong, pag bante kay mahulog ta," which means, "Be careful, we're going to fall off." Looking out the window, I saw we were at the top of a hill with a narrow, perilous road. One wrong turn could send us tumbling down. My cousins and I stayed quiet in the back, knowing not to panic, but my mom was visibly scared. My uncle drove slowly and carefully, and fortunately, we found a wide enough area to make a U-turn. After safely returning to the main road, we were all shaken and scared. Hours later, as night fell, the GPS was abandoned in favor of my family's memory of the roads from previous trips. We found ourselves driving uphill again, surrounded by trees and the sound of gravel under the car wheels. Suddenly, the road ended. Everyone fell silent. My mother asked my uncle to check outside. When they opened the door, a cold, strong wind blew, and the sound of rustling trees added to the eerie atmosphere. My uncle turned on the car's front lights, revealing a line of people standing in the woods. It was unsettling, and we had no idea what they were doing there. Exhausted and starving, I fell asleep again. When I woke up, we were on the main road, stopping at a 7-Eleven. My family bought hot dogs for my cousins and me. We were famished and drained of energy. This was the scariest experience of my life, and I'm grateful my family and I made it through safely. It was a stark reminder that GPS and maps can be outdated, and you can't always rely on them for accurate directions. Hey everyone, I've been lurking here for a while and thought I'd share a strange experience from about 7 years ago that's been haunting me ever since. I've been a trucker for over a decade, and you hear all sorts of stories on the road, but this one still gives me chills. I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest when I decided to pull over at a rundown truck stop for the night. There were only a few other trucks parked there. As I was getting ready to settle in, I overheard a couple of guys talking near one of the trucks. They seemed on edge, whispering urgently. I caught snippets of their conversation and heard one of them say, "Watch out for the lizards." I thought it was a weird thing to say, but didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was some local slang or inside joke. As the night wore on, I started to drift off, but then I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. It was strange because it didn't sound like just one person. It was like a small group was walking around, but the pattern was irregular and unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked out of my window. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but there were definitely figures moving around the parking area. They seemed to be skulking between the trucks, almost like they were looking for something. I told myself it was probably just other drivers stretching their legs, but the unease wouldn't go away. Suddenly, I heard a sharp knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I called out, asking who it was, but there was no response, just the sound of footsteps shuffling away. At this point, I was too spooked to investigate further, so I locked my doors and tried to get some sleep. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard a low, hissing sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was faint but persistent, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Throughout the night, I could hear knocks and scratches on the other trucks around me. Every once in a while, there was some sort of yelling or moaning coming from the distance, like someone or something was trying to communicate or call out. Occasionally, a smoky smell, like a cigarette, would waft through the air when these creatures were close to my truck. The rest of the night was a blur of eerie sounds and creeping dread. I kept telling myself it was just some weird local prank, but the whole thing felt off. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I didn't waste a second. I fired up my truck and got out of there without even looking back. I didn't want to see what might have been left in the morning. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to those lizards than meets the eye. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, or maybe there's something out there in those backwoods truck stops that we're better off not knowing about. Stay safe out there, and keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be lurking in the dark. About 2 years ago, my fiancée, my best friend, and I decided to visit a popular hiking trail nearby. This trail leads to a large rock that juts out over a cliff, offering a stunning view of our city. The trail is a long walk through the woods, mostly straight, then it takes a sharp turn, narrows, and becomes very steep. After this challenging section, you reach an open field, and you can see the rock above you. One more path leads to the rock. Despite the hike being lengthy, the path is straightforward and hard to miss, as it's the only trail in that part of the woods, at least that I've found. I had hiked it multiple times, even late at night after watching fireworks on the 4th of July. So, when we were walking near the road leading to the trail, we decided to visit. It was around 7 p.m., and it started to get dark quickly. We didn't even make it past the first part of the trail, which goes straight for about an hour before the sharp turn. As it was getting dark, we decided to turn around. We all had our flashlights on, and everything seemed normal. The path is typically dark, surrounded by trees, but there's one spot where the trees open up, giving a clear view of downtown. It feels very high up, as the trail is on the hillside surrounding the town. If you've been to Pennsylvania, you get it. We reached this clearing, but the view of the town looked flipped, like an image reversed on your phone. It was late, dark, and we were tired, so we didn't take it seriously, though we felt uneasy and thought everything seemed backwards. My fiancé mentioned feeling off, which was unusual for him, and my best friend, who has anxiety, agreed. I noted the clearing looked strange, and they agreed but thought they were just being silly. We should have been close to the exit, but it felt like we were going in circles. The path started to change, so we turned back towards the rock to figure out where we were. Returning to the clearing, it still looked odd, so we took photos. We knew we were on the right path because we hadn't strayed from it. We tried heading back to the exit again, but it didn't lead us out. Instead, we found ourselves in a part of the woods we'd never seen before. There was a door in the ground, possibly an old mine entrance, though we couldn't find any record of a mine being there. There were about 5 or 6 white chairs in a circle, with pieces of white cloth scattered around and beer bottles. There was no fire pit, making it seem more eerie. Lost and scared, we tried calling and texting for help, but no one responded, likely because it was late. After what felt like walking in circles, we suddenly found the exit and left quickly. Almost immediately, I received replies to my messages. Another strange thing was my fiance's phone had taken 1,032 burst photos at 10:32 p.m., all white, despite the flashlight being on at the same time. The photos were taken while we were lost. We didn't return for about a year. When we did, my fiancé and I tried to find the strange path in the door, but found nothing unusual except for a giant meat grinder. This experience has made me wary of the woods, and it still bothers me. My fiancé doesn't like talking about it because there's no explanation, but my best friend and I still discuss it, trying to find answers. Any similar experiences or theories would be appreciated. The summer of 2008 was a challenging time to graduate from college. After 4 years of hard work, the job market had nearly vanished. While I was disappointed about being unemployed, I discovered a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and attending college in western Montana, I was familiar with hiking and camping. But that summer, it became an escape, almost an obsession. Daily hikes and camping under the stars significantly improved my mental health as I worried about my future and life's purpose. In June, the weather was unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. Daytime highs barely reached 50 degrees, and at night, temperatures dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week and wasn't going to let the conditions deter me. My plan was to hike from Storm Lake over Storm Lake Pass and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, an alpine reservoir, requires a 4x4 pickup and skilled driving to reach. The road is a narrow two-track winding through thick pine forests. Despite the rain making the way slick, I made it to the top without much trouble. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable, cold, and nothing biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander as I sat on the shore. The rain created a constant light drizzle, producing natural white noise. My daydreams were cut short when a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine, yet there are no roads beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. I thought it might be a plane, but the sound wasn't getting closer or farther away. It was stationary and constant, coming from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. This wasn't a plane, truck, or bulldozer. Though not outright scary, my hair stood on end as I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, leaving only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to prepare dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I dislike trout. It's edible but unappetizing, tasting like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. The crackling fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were comforting, starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself to build up the fire before bed. As I walked to my pile of scavenged firewood, away from the fire's crackling, I heard the all-too-familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was louder and closer than before. Frustrated and tired, I yelled into the blackness of the night, demanding the noise to stop. Suddenly, the rumbling ceased, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackling, my rapid breathing, and the silence beyond the darkness. I had felt alone but safe before. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond the firelight, it seemed there were a million eyes watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out. My tent was being pushed down by the storm's force. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling under my tent. The storm wasn't letting up, and the urge to get to the pickup was growing stronger. I grabbed what I could, ripped open the tent flaps, and ran for the truck. Soaking wet, I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped to dry out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up, but I was warm from the heater and riding a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain, keeping the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours had passed in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drunk enough to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The poles shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my gear to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. when I finished packing up. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy, treacherous road, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I've never been back to Storm Lake, and I probably never will. In 2018, I decided to take my young son and our dog to a remote area in the Francis Marion and Sumter National Forest to try out a new camper shell on my recently purchased truck. Being an avid outdoorsman who loves to hunt and camp, this seemed like the perfect opportunity. We found a secluded spot off a dirt road, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. Around 11 p.m., I was awakened by my dog growling. When I looked out the back of the truck, I saw what appeared to be hundreds of small white lights darting around in the distance, then hovering and slowly converging on our campsite. They resembled the dust orbs often seen in videos, but were producing light in the pitch-black forest. Soon, they surrounded our truck, with what seemed like hundreds of these soft white lights that didn't blink. After about 30 minutes of watching them float around us, I mustered the courage to open the truck and light a lantern. The orbs promptly disappeared. However, once I turned off the light and locked up again, they returned. Thankfully, my son slept through the entire experience. I watched the lights until I finally fell asleep around 1 a.m. The next morning, I discovered that the battery in my new truck was dead, even though we hadn't used any power in the back cab. A week later, I had to replace the electric control module. I'm not sure if this is connected, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Has anyone else experienced something similar? Just thinking about it again makes the hair on my neck stand up. I was tree planting near Smithers, BC, deep in the mountains on dirt roads. What happened during one of those nights is something I've tried to forget, as I couldn't find any rational explanation for it. It doesn't matter to me whether people believe this or not, but here's what occurred. Almost midnight, I was trying to sleep in my tent, which was pitched near a group of standing dead trees that made a distinct creaking sound when the wind blew. However, that night was completely silent and still. Suddenly, I began to hear sticks cracking and the sound of footsteps, gradually getting closer over about 15 minutes. It was loud enough for me to be certain that a bear was approaching my tent. It came so close that it must have been no more than 15 feet away, with sticks cracking and footsteps moving around the forest floor. In response, I yelled out loudly. What followed was absolute silence. No sound of the creature fleeing or doing anything at all. I sat there, too scared to move, trying to make sense of it all. After about 20 minutes of this unsettling silence, I heard the eeriest, most unnatural sound. It mimicked the creaking of the trees but wasn't quite right. Instead of a regular creak, it held the exact same note for a full 5 seconds or longer. It was like an unnatural drone, clearly not a tree creaking, especially since there was no wind or other trees making any noise. I barely slept that night, and the following day was tough. For a long time, I tried to forget about it. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that I learned about skinwalkers imitating sounds, which made me reconsider the experience. This happened in July 2022. If anyone has had a similar experience or has any idea what this could have been, I'd love to hear. My spouse and I first met during our freshman year of college, around 14 years ago. For some context, our group of friends loved taking walks in the woods surrounding our campus. Since everyone had classes and work during the day, we often went for walks at night. It felt perfectly natural and safe to us. One particular night, just before Halloween, most of our friends dropped out of the planned walk due to various reasons like homework or being tired. Eventually, it was just my future spouse and me. Our last remaining friend suggested we go on the walk together anyway. Despite the initial awkwardness, we decided to be adventurous and make the best of it. We set out into the woods as acquaintances and chose a path leading to a place called the altar site, named for a log that resembled an altar where students left knickknacks. However, in the dark, we soon realized we were getting lost. We joked about having to spend the night out there, and I quipped, "I hope you're not afraid of survival cuddling." After walking in circles for about 45 minutes, we decided to pick a straight line and walk through the woods, hoping to reach a road or the ocean, which surrounded the forest. Our trek was rough, involving walking into trees, rivers, and swamps, until we stumbled onto a larger trail. We followed it with relief, thinking we were finally on the right path. However, as we reached a small meadow, we lost sight of the trail again. As we entered the tree line on the other side, we heard a loud, eerie scream nearby. It was unlike anything we'd heard before, and it lasted for about 10 seconds. We were terrified and decided to head back to the meadow for some visibility. In the meadow, we heard a thick branch snap and saw a bushy tree shake. Another scream followed, even louder and closer this time. I instinctively hugged my acquaintance out of fear, which was a bit awkward. He later told me that hug would have been more enjoyable if he hadn't been so scared. We then noticed what looked like a trail curving around the bend. We carefully made our way up the new path, using our flip phones as makeshift flashlights. As we walked, I heard a pattern of crunching leaves behind us, as if something was moving from side to side, trying to stay out of sight. Then we heard another scream, right behind us. We started running and soon found ourselves in a large meadow near campus. We ran to the paved road and didn't hear the creature follow us out of the woods, though we heard one last scream from the tree line. We ran back to our dorms, promising to talk about it in the morning. That night, I tried to identify the sound online, hoping it was a screeching owl, but nothing matched the human-like quality of the scream. The next day, we told our friends, and the story quickly became an urban legend on campus, known as the Banshee in the Woods. Years later, a friend suggested it might have been a cougar, which I confirmed through research. Despite my woodland experience, I had never heard a cougar scream before. We were able to track cougar sightings and activity around campus, which lined up with our encounter. This shared experience brought us closer, and though it took some time, we eventually realized we wanted more than friendship. We got married a few years ago and told the story at our wedding, surprising some friends and family who hadn't heard it before. We now work creatively together, spending most days side by side. While the experience sparked our relationship, it also left me with some lingering fear of the woods at night, causing occasional panic attacks. Nonetheless, we've made progress over the years, and I cherish how this adventure brought us together. My sister, cousin, and I often hang out when my sister and I visit our grandparents. Our cousin lives in South Carolina, while we live in a small town in North Carolina. One evening, we were all sitting on my grandma's back porch, chatting and spending time together. My grandparents' house is surrounded by woods, and we kept hearing noises from inside the house, even though my grandparents were asleep. We went inside and into a room where we continued talking, joking around, and looking at videos we took while outside. In one of the videos, we noticed a figure inside the sliding glass doors staring at us, but we dismissed it. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., my sister fell asleep, and my cousin and I were still awake. We heard heavy footsteps in the hallway and what sounded like a bag rustling. We were both really scared, so we turned on some music and eventually fell asleep. The next night, we went out to the pool and hot tub. I saw a figure about 6 or 7 feet tall in the woods, just watching us. Frightened, we got out, went back inside, and locked all the doors. The same thing happened the following night. Our grandma didn't believe us because she doesn't usually believe in such things. But this figure kept appearing in the woods every night from midnight until 5 a.m. This experience occurred when I was camping alone in a forest in Wales. I live in England, near the Welsh border, and I've done this many times before and since. It was probably April or May in 2013 or 2014, during an unseasonably warm spell. This was the second of 3 nights I had planned for my trip, though it ended up being the last. The first night and the second day were fantastic. I had a great hike and a delicious lunch at a pub. Afterward, I returned to my campsite, read a book, had some beers, and went to sleep around 11 p.m. or midnight. As I was drifting off, I became aware of a melodic sound outside the tent. It wasn't very close, maybe about 50 feet away, and it sounded like someone perfectly humming a tune. After listening for a while, it was clear that it was indeed someone humming flawlessly like a professional singer. It was incredibly unsettling, like something out of a horror movie. I stayed in my tent, but the humming remained a distant background noise. Not knowing what to do, I eventually gathered the courage to peek outside the tent. As soon as I did, the humming stopped abruptly, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. Trying to rationalize the situation, I assumed it was a prank. I shouted something like, "You're not funny, go away," which made me feel slightly better. After about 10 seconds of silence, I started to relax. But as I reached for the tent zipper, the humming started again, much louder and closer, from a completely different direction. My heart sank because there was no way someone could have moved so quickly without me noticing. The woods were utterly silent, and there was no breeze. I stormed out of the tent, ready to confront whoever it was. Then I saw it, a humanoid figure silhouetted against the tree line, about 15 feet away. It was tall and thin, over 7 feet, with unnaturally long limbs and a small, rounded head. It seemed to be gray, though it was hard to tell in the moonlight. The figure had no discernible features and swayed slightly, like a person standing still but shifting weight. Paralyzed by fear, I stood there, unable to move. The humming stopped, and then it started again, but this time it was softly singing my name in what sounded like my voice. It was eerie and distorted, as if a non-human entity was trying to mimic human speech. This went on for about 10 seconds, though it felt much longer. Suddenly, I managed to turn and run as fast as I could through the woods, in just my socks and pajamas. After sprinting for about 2 minutes, I stopped and leaned against a tree, panting and trying to calm down. The forest was completely silent. I stayed by the tree for about 2 hours, waiting for my heart rate to settle and deciding what to do. I needed my phone and car keys to get home, so I had to go back to my tent. Eventually, I made my way back, grabbed my phone and keys, and hurried to my car. I spent the rest of the night in the back seat, too shaken to sleep. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left as quickly as I could. That experience was so traumatic that I took a break from solo camping for over 2 years, even though I usually go every few months. This encounter has stayed with me and changed my perspective on supernatural experiences. I don't know what was in the woods that night, but it left a lasting scar. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and my childhood friend Joe and I spent as much time as we could outdoors. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a large forest. My parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend, only coming out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen, building shelters, setting traps, and trying to make fire with sticks. When we were in high school, we decided to have our own adventure inspired by the movie Stand By Me. Our idea was to walk along the railroad tracks in the countryside, find cool bridges to fish from, and camp a little ways off the tracks. We knew it was risky and likely trespassing, but we were just kids. We had a great time. We found beautiful rivers, discovered hidden bridges, fished, and hid from passing trains. At night, we camped in the woods near the tracks, making small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic, and we did it multiple times without any problems. After high school, Joe and I went our separate ways, but we stayed in touch and tried to visit each other whenever we could. One summer in the mid-90s, we both happened to be in town for about a week. During the day, we spent time with our families, and at night, we either caught drinks at a bar or sat around a fire at Joe's house reminiscing about the old days. One night, we started talking about our Stand By Me trips. Fueled by nostalgia and beer, we decided to recreate one of those adventures. We planned to walk the rails for a day, camp for one night, and walk back home. My wife dropped us off at our old starting spot just outside our hometown. She thought we were crazy and made sure to mention it. When she left, Joe suggested we walk in the opposite direction this time, just for fun. We knew the area well and had a map, so I agreed. The day was enjoyable and a bit bittersweet. We found a bridge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We didn't have fishing gear, but we had canned food and other supplies. Before nightfall, we chose a spot to camp in a thick forested area. It felt like a tunnel with trees on both sides of the tracks. We had small hammocks to sleep in, but before setting them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. This was a habit from our younger days. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and up a small incline to ensure we weren't camping in someone's yard. From the top of the hill, we saw an old building at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We debated what to do, assuming it was a sugar shack since there was no clear road leading to it. As we got closer, we realized it was an old church. It looked abandoned for years, with wooden planks blackened from moss and rot. A weathered cross still stood on top. The windows had no glass, and the doorways were open. Inside, we saw rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher. We didn't go all the way in, feeling uneasy about the place. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, paths, or roads. We went back up the hill to our camping spot, feeling a bit better with the hill between us and the church, though still uneasy. It was dusk, so we set up our hammocks and went to sleep, planning to leave early in the morning. As night fell and we lay in our hammocks talking, we began to hear something from the direction of the church. Our conversation went something like this. "Do you hear that? What is that?" "It sounds like people singing." It did sound like singing. We slipped out of our hammocks and crouched, straining to hear more. The singing continued, not getting louder, so we decided to sneak back up the hill to see where it was coming from. Moving quietly was second nature to us from our childhood adventures. The moonlight provided just enough visibility. We didn't use flashlights and stayed silent. When we reached the top, we saw light in the distance coming from the church. The singing was coming from inside. Joe and I exchanged a whispered conversation, trying to make sense of it. The light flickered like candlelight, and though we tried, we couldn't make out the words being sung. It sounded like church music in another language. We watched for a while, seeing only occasional shadows. We didn't intend to get any closer, maintaining about a football field's distance. The singing continued for a while and then stopped. A booming male voice began to chant, which thoroughly scared me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Eventually, the male voice would say something, and a chorus of voices would respond in song. This lasted for a while. Then they broke into a long, sustained wail that grew louder and more disturbing until I covered my ears. Then it abruptly stopped. Just as I was about to suggest leaving, Joe grabbed my shoulder and whispered, "They're coming out!" We watched as a line of figures walked out of the church, holding hands in single file. Some had flashlights, and they began to move towards us, singing again. We ran back to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and bolted for the tracks. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back, seeing lights moving erratically down the hill. We continued running and walking as fast as we could. Eventually, we stopped seeing the lights and reached a road. According to our map, a small town was about 15 minutes away, so we walked there, reached a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to pick us up. My wife and friends thought it was just kids messing around, but those voices didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing I've ever experienced in the woods. My 3-year-old son suffered from chronic ear infections last year, which often led to high fevers. I slept with him one night to give him Tylenol throughout the night to keep his fever down and keep him comfortable. I set my alarm to wake me up at around 2:30 a.m. When I woke up, I went into the kitchen to get the Tylenol. I noticed a bright light shining into the apartment from our deck door, which also illuminated part of the woods behind the apartment. When I went over to see what it was, I saw a car with bright LED headlights in the parking lot to the far back right of the apartment. I figured they were dropping someone off. I saw a movement that resembled a dog walking around near the woods. I thought the lady who usually walks her dog, a cute little corgi, in that area had parked her car to light her way. As it got closer, I realized there was nobody walking the dog, and there was no dog. I don't know what it was that I saw, but I'll describe it the best I can. At first, it looked like a dog, corgi-sized, but as it walked closer, it looked like a house cat. Then it appeared to be a black bear, and then it looked like a koala. I live in North New Jersey, farmland and lots of woods, and there are no wild koalas here. At this point, my heart was pounding out of my chest, and I was scared. The fear I felt was a primal type of fear I had never felt before. I ran to my bedroom to wake up my boyfriend and shook him awake. I said, "You gotta come see this." He was a bit annoyed with me. When we looked outside together, we saw this thing getting closer, and now it looked like a skunk with a white stripe down the center and a perky, fluffy tail. I said, "Oh, it's just a skunk," with a little chuckle. I felt embarrassed that I woke him up over a skunk, but I also felt relieved. However, I was mistaken. As it walked, it looked like it was struggling to find a form. It looked like it was falling apart, but also coming back together again at the same time. I know this doesn't make sense, but it's hard to find the words for what we saw. After the skunk formation, it looked like a person crawling on the ground with some type of fur or skin attached to their leg. Then it changed again and looked like a raccoon, groundhog, black bear, cat, koala, deer, and skunk. The part that stuck out to me the most was that whatever it was seemed to be coming apart or shedding, but at the same time growing. Whoever had their headlights on turned them off as it went deeper into the woods. This happened pretty quickly in about a couple of minutes from start to finish. He went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep after that, so I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the woods to see if I could see it again, but it was gone. I also opened the door to see if I could hear anything, but I couldn't. It was very quiet. I had a very hard time going back to sleep that night. My boyfriend wasn't scared, but was confused and stunned. He didn't know what to make of it. I was scared and creeped out. I know if I hadn't woken him up to see it for himself, he most likely wouldn't believe me and would have chalked it all up to me being groggy from just waking up or it being an animal. Unfortunately, I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Hey everyone! For a little backstory, my name is Miles, and I live in a small town in Georgia. Most of my life, I lived in a community but recently moved to a more rural area. The house that I am in is around 45 to 50 years old and sits on a good plot of land. Anyway, let's get to the story. So I moved in a few months ago, and nothing was out of the ordinary. I live with my mom, sister, and 3 dogs. So when I would hear something outside or an odd noise, I would chalk it up to it just being one of them. About 2 weeks after moving in is when things started happening. One night, I just finished doing all the things I needed to do before bed and was relieved to see my comfy bed. I fell asleep like any other night, but woke up around 2 in the morning to this odd noise. Like someone calling for something. I grabbed my phone, then walked over to the window. I live on the 2nd story, to shine my flashlight outside. Nothing, just our yard and the woods. Then I hear it again, this time more clearer. Someone was yelling out for help. I got extremely nervous and took a step back from the window. I was about to walk to my mom's room to tell her, but I stopped myself. I waited to hear it again before going to tell her. With nothing for around 2 minutes, I went back to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I asked my mom and sister if they heard anything. Both of them said they didn't hear anything and slept like a baby. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on my and went to do some school and yard work. Night comes and I am letting my dogs run around in the backyard to use the bathroom and have some outdoor time before it was lights out. I was playing Clash of Clans on my phone when I realized I didn't hear my dogs playing or walking around. I looked up and they were staring at something in a little clearing before you hit the woods. I looked in the direction of where their heads were and saw an outline of a deer. The deer was on its 4 legs, but just staring at me. I told the dogs to come in and they didn't move a muscle. I kept yelling and yelling until my mom came outside to ask me what the issue was. I told her to look in the direction of the deer, but there was nothing there. The dogs were still staring at something, so I just pulled them inside and locked the door. When I looked out the window, I saw it again, this time closer. I locked every door in the house and headed up for bed. I woke up at around 2 a.m. again to someone yelling. But this time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. My mom sent me a text saying, "Is that you?" To which I replied, "No." I listened very carefully to the yelling. This time it was saying Boone. Boone is the name of my youngest dog. I was shitting bricks and ran to my mom's room to talk about what the fuck was going on when I froze at the door. I heard something walking outside under my window. I didn't move at all. I was basically pissing myself thinking someone was about to break in. Probably a good time to mention my sister was at a friend's house for the night, so it was just me, my mom, and the dogs. Whatever was outside walking around didn't sound human. It sounded like a deer or dog walking around. My dogs sleep in my mom's room, so I thought it was that weird deer I saw earlier. Then the most terrifying guiding I could think of took place. Boom! The sound of this thing was nothing like I have ever heard before. I ran to my mom's room ADN. She was already on the phone with the police. Stupidly, I walked to my mom's window, opened it, and said, "Fuck OFF asshole." I head fast and heavy footsteps run from my side of the house to my mom's side. I closed the window and heard this thing scratch at the walls of the first floor. Then police sirens filled the air and this thing bolted into the woods. I looked out the window to see it and saw a fucking deer on 2 legs. The police knocked on our door and got our statements. We walked around the house and saw footprints, scratched on the wood and windows, and even a piece of an antler. When the cops left me and my mom stayed up till light broke the sky. I am very familiar with ski walkers, but never thought they were real. This was only 4 days ago and I still hear this thing at night. If anyone can help me rationalize this, you are more than welcome to reply. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me introduce myself and provide some context. My name is Tyler. I'm 16 years old, and I'm a junior at a semi-private school. This event occurred nearly 3 years ago, so my recollection might be a bit hazy. But anyway, here goes. It was late October in 2017. I had just gotten home after a long day of school and decided to hop on my PS4 to play some Call of Duty. Black Ops 3 with friends online. As the hours passed, various friends joined and left the game. I was home alone for the week because my parents were on a business trip to Georgia and also visiting family. It wasn't the first time I had to stay home alone for an extended period. Normally, I went to bed around 9:30 p.m., but since it was a Friday and I was alone, I decided to stay up. Time flew by, and soon it was 1:20 a.m. I was in the middle of a match and didn't want to get up and turn everything off, so I decided to finish the game before going to bed. Suddenly, a terrible, musty smell hit my nostrils. It was so bad that I gagged and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep through it. Hoping the smell would go away, I played a few more matches, but it only got stronger and closer. Trying to ignore it, I continued playing with my noise-canceling headset on, but I swore I heard footsteps behind me. I dismissed it, thinking it was the game's 3D sound effects. Then I heard tapping. I took off my headset to check if it was from the game, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the window behind me, with the outside light on. I could see a silhouette of something almost human-like through the shades. Frozen in fear, I stared at the silhouette, wondering if I was just tired and imagining things. The figure's head tilted to the side like a bird, and it tapped on the window again in the same pattern. Adrenaline surged through me, and I decided to open the shades out of curiosity. As I got closer, the stench grew stronger, clearly the smell of something decaying. I thought it might be a dying animal, but the rhythmic tapping made me question that theory. Summoning my courage, I pulled back the curtains, and what I saw horrified me. It had a human face, but where its eyes should have been, there were just empty sockets. Its sharp, jagged teeth looked capable of tearing through steel, and its face was decomposing. It appeared to have been dead for a long time. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, unable to take my eyes off the creature. Tilted its head sharply, startling me into a scream. The creature quickly retreated into the woods, moving awkwardly and with a contorted body. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the experience haunted me for weeks. I haven't seen the creature since that night. I'm sharing this now because in class a few weeks ago we learned about Native American cryptids, and the description of a skinwalker matched what I saw. The only unsettling detail is that a skinwalker usually takes the form of something it has killed. I can't help but wonder who it might have taken its form from. I just hope I never encounter it again, because who knows what it might do if our paths cross once more. This story took place in July. My husband and I decided to take our 2 kids camping for the weekend since there wasn't much else to do due to the pandemic. We love camping and had never taken them before. Our daughter is 2 and our son is 6. We went to our usual spot where the campsites are about half a mile apart. As it started getting dark, our kids got scared and wanted to leave, so we decided to take them to my dad's for the weekend and then went back to the campsite ourselves. Around midnight, we decided it was time to go to bed. We lay down and fell asleep rather quickly, but about an hour or 2 later, I woke up and had to pee. I woke my husband, and he got up to walk with me to the bathroom, which was about halfway between campsites. On our way back, we saw a light coming from our campsite, which worried us. We thought maybe our family was looking for us, so we walked quickly back. Just before we stepped out of the trees, my husband threw his arm out to stop me. Me? What? Him? Shoo! I stayed quiet and looked back at the campsite. I saw the light and then noticed a glint of silver in someone's hand. A long knife. We ducked down and hid behind some trees. In typical scary movie fashion, the person heard us move and shined the light toward the woods. They started running towards us, and we took off in the opposite direction. We could hear them running behind us, but then the light disappeared. Eventually, we managed to circle around to the road and crept slowly back to my husband's SUV. We got in, drove away as fast as we could, and called the police. They had us take them back to the campsite, and we waited in the car while they checked the area. Soon, more police cars arrived, and 2 officers came up to ask us to walk to the tent with them. What we saw was shocking. Our tent was slashed to pieces, as was all of our stuff. The police ended up evacuating all the other campers and swept the entire area, but didn't find anything except a flashlight along the path we had run. We follow up with the police every month, but there have been no updates. I'll post if anything new comes up. As a teenager who has been involved in scouting for most of my life, I enjoy exploring with my friends and the increased trust that comes with age. A few years ago, 2 girls named Amy and Harriet and I were asked to head into the woods around our campsite to find a long, straight stick suitable for carving into a point. I was much younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy was only a year older than me. We walked in a straight line to avoid getting lost, memorizing our surroundings to find our way back easily. After about 15 minutes, we couldn't find anything suitable, so we decided to head back to the campsite. That's when the initial panic set in. The trees seemed to have knitted themselves together in such a way that our path appeared non-existent. It was as if the trail had vanished. We looked around 360 degrees, and everything looked exactly the same. Trees we could have sworn were different now appeared as copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought was the right direction, shouting for help. Eventually, we came to a concrete path, almost like a road but very narrow, splitting the forest in two. We didn't follow the path since it seemed to go in the wrong direction relative to our campsite. On the other side of the path was more forest, but nearby we saw an abandoned shack, likely used for storage. We had no idea anything like this was out here in these woods, so we just kept walking. Eventually, we came to a road we didn't recognize. A woman wearing a pink and purple regatta outdoors coat walked by, and we frantically asked her for directions to our campsite. By now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we had been walking for an hour and a half. She said she had never seen us before, but pointed us toward another campsite in a specific direction. We followed her advice and eventually made it back to our campsite. We frantically apologized for being gone so long and for not finding anything. The leader, Ian, looked at us confused and said we had only been gone for 25 minutes and that our free time was still ongoing. To this day, this baffles all three of us. Our free time was supposed to be 40 minutes long, yet our watches and phones said we had been gone for hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, as if we had entered an area where the concept of time didn't apply. I believe in the paranormal, but this was unlike anything I had ever heard or experienced before. It felt as if we had been in a time vortex, where hours in the forest were only minutes in the rest of the world. The feeling was very strange and stayed with me for the rest of the camp. One night, my friend Sam and I decided to go out for a smoke. I got into his old Ford, and we set off. Living in Vermont, we knew there were plenty of hidden spots to explore. That night, we were bored and wanted to find a new place to hang out. It was one of those nights where we knew we'd be out until at least 3 a.m. I had already told my parents I was staying at his house, and his mom didn't mind us coming back late. We left his house around 10:30, picked up some supplies from a local dealer, and started driving down the familiar back roads we had known all our lives. We took random turns, hoping to find a new spot, but we weren't making much progress. Being high school students, any sign of life or the possibility of encountering a cop made us uneasy, which limited our options. Eventually, we found ourselves in the middle of nowhere, driving down winding back roads. I spotted a turnoff with no signs or markings, and we decided to check it out. It appeared to be an access road to some power lines. After driving up the access road, which was just 2 tire tracks separated by grass, we reached a small clearing with a makeshift parking lot for service vehicles. We set up in the front seat with the car on and headlights pointed at the forest while we smoked. After a while, there was a lull in the conversation, and we were both just staring at the forest, feeling quite baked. Suddenly, Sam sat up and asked, "Is that a deer?" I sat up and looked where he was pointing. It looked like a deer resting on the gravel, but something about it seemed unnatural. Sam drove closer, and we both got out, turning off the car and using our phone flashlights. As we approached, we realized it was a deer, but only the head and skin with no meat or blood, just the head attached to the skin. We were both taken aback, muttering things like, "What the heck? Why would a hunter clean a deer and just leave the head and skin?" I said, feeling uneasy. "I don't know," Sam replied, picking up a stick and flipping the skin over. There was a strange symbol carved into it, resembling a plus sign with curved lines and embellishments. We didn't think to take a picture, but in hindsight, we probably should have. Almost immediately after, we heard noises coming from down the power lines. For those who don't know, when there are big power lines running through the forest, the area underneath is cleared, leaving a narrow strip of land without trees. The access road was on a ridge, and the power line ran perpendicular to it, allowing us to see down the hill and up the other side through the clearing. Hearing the noises, we turned off our flashlights, assuming it was some service workers about to catch us. We stopped and listened. The sounds grew louder, like people breaking sticks. Suddenly, 20 to 25 people burst out of the tree line about 100 yards away, sprinting from one side to the other. The starlight was bright enough for us to see that the men wore black, Amish-looking clothing without hats, and the women wore white dresses, holding them above their knees as they ran across the clearing. We had no idea why they were running, but instinctively, Sam and I sprinted back to his car. Sam peeled out of the parking spot, and we sped down the access road. As we drove, I kept repeating, "What the heck? What the heck? What the heck?" We were both laughing hysterically at the absurdity of what we had just seen. Then, out of nowhere, two shining dots appeared in front of us. Huge yellow eyes, followed by a massive silhouette filling the windshield, and then bang. We both screamed as Sam slammed on the brakes. "Was that an owl?" Sam shouted. "We are not stopping. Go, go, go!" I yelled back. We made it back to the main road and then to his house around 2:30 a.m. We smoked some more and talked about what we had seen. To this day, we still talk about it, not knowing what we witnessed. Were those people running towards something or away from something? We have no idea. Although it doesn't make much sense, we both feel like the owl was related to what we saw, though we can't explain how. When I was about 13, my siblings and I would visit our grandparents at their house in Georgia. The house was perched on a mountain in the middle of the woods. It was a pretty big place. Fun during the mornings when we could swim and do other activities, but once nightfall came, it got eerie. My sister and I always slept in the living room, where we typically watched scary videos, trying to freak ourselves out. It was even scarier because the front door was mostly glass, and we were always on edge, thinking someone might be watching us. Every time we visited, something strange seemed to happen. For example, one time we were in the living room when we heard a crash from the kitchen. A plate that was on the counter, far from the edge, had somehow flown off and shattered everywhere. But the scariest incident we encountered happened one night when we went to get snacks. In the pantry, we saw a huge, fresh handprint on the window, bigger than any handprint we had ever seen before. We brushed it off and started watching our usual scary videos. One video mentioned that if you whistled at night and something whistled back, it meant a skinwalker was nearby. Of course, us being kids, we wanted to try it out. So we went outside on the porch in the middle of the woods and whistled. We got no response and went back inside. A few minutes later, the dog started barking like crazy, and we saw movement outside. We freaked out and tried to go to sleep. The next morning, we woke up to find that someone or something had been on the property and scratched my grandfather's truck extensively. After this, we asked our grandparents and stepmom if anything weird had ever happened in the area. To our surprise, we found out some pretty creepy information. Years ago, before any of us were born, they had lived in a different house nearby. Apparently, a lot of creepy stuff happened on that property, such as dark figures floating around the house. They even woke up one night to see what seemed to be a group performing a ritual with fire in a circle outside the house. They later moved out, and the house burned down under mysterious circumstances, which were later proven to be caused by human actions, though the intentions were unknown. To add to the creepiness, the house was apparently built on Native American burial grounds. It still baffles my mind, all the strange occurrences. Was it a cult? Ghosts and demons? Did these things somehow follow them to the new house? Was it a bear, a skinwalker, or a human who scratched my grandfather's truck? This isn't exactly terrifying, but it's definitely unsettling. I grew up in New York, about 2 hours north of NYC, in a small town off a state highway. Our house was small but sat on a big piece of land. Behind it stretched a forest that went on for miles. There was a trail accessible from our property, but I never ventured onto it. My grandma often stayed with us. Every year, around the same time, some sort of fungus or something similar would grow on our land. They weren't mushrooms exactly, but they looked like large reptile eggs. My grandma would always tell us to stay away from these eggs, because the witch put them there. She also warned us to stay away from the trail, saying, "The witch lived there." I was around 5 or 6 at the time, and while I didn't believe in the witch, I did heed my grandma's advice and avoided both the trail and the eggs. One day, my sister and I were playing outside while my grandma watched us. The eggs had already appeared by this time. We were running around when we glanced at the entrance of the trail and froze. Standing there was a white woman dressed in a black robe and a black hat. Without hesitation, my sister and I bolted inside, with my grandma following us. My sister doesn't remember this much now, and my grandma is too old to recall it. However, I have an eidetic memory and vivid memories from as young as 3 or 4. It's possible this memory is something I somehow created, but it feels real and distinct, just like my other childhood memories. I've always believed there are things in the woods we don't understand and have reason to fear. I am a firm believer in skinwalkers. I would love for someone to help me figure out what was growing in my yard. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and I used to work as a security guard at a place called the Red Brick Lofts. I'll refer to it as TRBL. It's just minutes from downtown and home to some low-key celebrities like some of Andre 3000 and Erykah Badu's family members. This place was originally a Sears factory in the early 1900s. My coworkers often shared eerie stories about the place, mentioning suicides and ghost sightings. I used to laugh it off until I experienced something myself. One July afternoon, while I was patrolling inside TRBL and doing my daily log, I heard a loud gunshot from within the building. It turned out an elderly resident had taken his life, and I was one of the first to document the scene without touching anything, of course. The Dallas Police Headquarters is just across the street, so they and the ambulance arrived quickly. It was a traumatic experience, and my boss allowed me to take 2 weeks off. When I returned, everything seemed fine at first. However, I was then assigned to the overnight shift, which I was reluctant to take but did for the extra pay. On my first night, I stayed outside TRBL. I was supposed to patrol the entire building, but I couldn't muster the courage, so I fudged my log. On my second night, I ventured inside and had one of the scariest experiences of my life. There was an old daycare center on the first floor for residents' children, complete with a bomb shelter that looked like a sewage tunnel. I'd heard stories about a child who died in that shelter. Around 2 to 3 a.m., as I approached the daycare entrance, I heard a noise from inside. It sounded like someone aggressively opening a bag of chips. The door was locked, and there shouldn't have been anyone in there at that hour. The noise grew louder, so I turned on my flashlight, opened the door, and the noise abruptly stopped. The room was pitch black, and I saw nothing. I locked the door and quickly left. When I told my boss, he laughed and suggested it was just the pipes. I agreed to avoid seeming crazy, but deep down, I knew it wasn't pipes. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. TRBL still has many old doors and windows that lead nowhere. If you're from Dallas, I recommend checking the place out yourself. First, I'd like to state for the record that I do not believe in ghosts. Nevertheless, I have always been fascinated by them. Whenever my family and I go on vacation, we usually try to attend ghost tours. Many years ago, when I was still in elementary school, I attended a party mainly consisting of my family and some friends of my grandma on my mom's side. The party was held at a community center. The other children and I were pretending that a certain room in the center was haunted. I mentioned our game in passing to my mom. Suddenly, one of my grandmother's friends, who has sadly since passed away, asked if I wanted to hear a supernatural story from her own life. This friend was a nun for a while and lived in a rectory. One night, she and 2 other nuns, one of whom was much older, were walking down the hallway of the rectory when the older nun suddenly fainted. They helped her to her feet and guided her to her room, naturally curious about what had happened. The older nun, who was apparently as white as a sheet, claimed that as they were walking, she saw a nun walking across the room. Given that the rectory was home to many nuns, this wouldn't usually be out of the ordinary. However, 2 things made this situation unusual. First, the nun she saw had a blue outline around her, which is quite an unusual sight. Second, and most striking, was that the 3 nuns were the only people in the hallway at the time. The most puzzling aspect of the story is that the rectory did not have a reputation for being haunted. This was the only time anything like this happened, according to the friend. However, the elderly nun swore that what she saw was real. Eventually, the friend left the nunhood and never returned to that rectory. Although she was inclined to believe it was just the imagination of an old woman, she was never quite sure. As my dad was finishing his last few days of treatment and rehab, I visited him at the facility for Father's Day. Up until recently, he had been in a facility in Jamestown, North Dakota, next to the North Dakota State Hospital for several months. Somehow, we started talking about paranormal stuff and his experiences there. Here's a brief history of the hospital. It opened in 1885 as an institution for the mentally ill and criminally insane. Overcrowding soon became a major issue, leading to multiple expansions while remaining severely understaffed. In 1937, the governor replaced the superintendent and 75% of the staff, hiring new, underqualified people who mistreated the patients. By 1949, reports of overcrowding, neglect, malnutrition, and seclusion, including many tuberculosis patients, made the news. Reforms began in 1953, and by 1974, the population dropped from over 2,000 in the 1940s to about 600, and around 200 today. Yes, the place is still in operation. Today, the hospital provides psychiatric services, transitional living, and treatment for chemical dependency. My dad liked to stay busy, taking jobs and helping out wherever he could. The hospital was somewhat of a partner institution to his rehab facility, but the people there were more like inmates while he had more freedom. He often helped with laundry in the part of the hospital that functions as a prison. One day, after folding sheets and towels, they returned to find the sheets thrown on the floor. Everything stays locked, so no one could have entered. The lady he was helping said it was Charlie, the ghost who often does such things. She told my dad they have names for different ghosts all around the prison because there are so many. They even had to block off a few rooms because residents would refuse to stay in them due to creepy occurrences, forcing them to move. Even the old warden's office was so haunted that he threatened to quit if not given a new space. My dad said things would move around and fly off shelves. While there, my dad took a local job with a couple of guys doing lawn work on the hospital grounds and the cemetery. One afternoon, they were working near an old and used building with many windows. They saw someone inside and informed their boss, who said, "Nobody works in there. No one has been in there for years." They joked about seeing a ghost and learned that paranormal activity is common there. My dad, usually a no-nonsense person, saw the figure clearly enough to describe his clothes. The other guy, scared, asked, "Did you see what he was wearing?" My dad replied, "Yeah, someone's messing with us." That was a person. They kept working despite being creeped out and saw the figure again. The apparition walked quickly down the hallway towards them, then darted into the garage. He was dressed in an old-fashioned black and white suit with a hat and kept his head down, hiding his face. The other guy ran off, too scared to continue working, but my dad chased after the figure. They checked all possible doors but found no one. Their boss got the keys, and inside, they only saw their own footprints in the dust. There was no trace of the man they saw. My dad is convinced the place is haunted. That guy must have been up to something shady, ducking away from us and hiding his face, he said. One night, I had a ghostly encounter in my home. It happened just once. At that time, I lived alone and still do in the same house. I was 35 years old and had been living there for about 2 or 3 years without anything unusual happening. One night, I was reading in bed. My bedroom was of average size, and my bed faced the open door. I had no pets, so I didn't usually close the door. Reading before bed was a routine for me. That night, I had an eerie feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake it off. I tried to focus on my book, but the sensation was overwhelming. I kept glancing up, looking into the dark, silent main area of the house. I had locked the front and back doors, as always. I live in Minneapolis, not some isolated town. The feeling persisted, making it impossible to read. It was like being stared at while watching TV. You just know someone's eyes are on you. Despite the creepiness, I didn't feel threatened, just unnerved. I tried to dismiss it, but couldn't. I decided to turn off the light and try to sleep, but the sensation intensified. It felt like something was just outside my bedroom door, in the dark parts of the house. After a few minutes, I knew I couldn't sleep without making sure no one was there. What if it was a real person? I got up and turned on the dining room lights. Nobody was there. I laughed at myself for being paranoid and went back to bed. But as soon as I turned off the light, the feeling returned, just as strong. Determined to be sure, I got up again and turned on all the lights. Armed with a softball bat, I checked every room, closet, and even the basement. I double-checked the doors and windows, all were locked. I even went upstairs, which was under renovation, and looked everywhere. By now, about an hour had passed. If someone had been hiding, they would have had plenty of chances to escape. I felt confident I was alone and that my mind was playing tricks on me. Returning to my bedroom, I turned off all the lights except the bedside lamp and tried to read again. But the sensation came back. I started paying closer attention to it. I didn't feel in danger or sense an evil spirit. It felt like a presence, intentionally making itself known without trying to scare me. I called out to the darkness, asking it to leave, but nothing changed. I even tried phrases like, "Go into the light," inspired by the Poltergeist movie. Despite my doubts about ghosts, I didn't know what else to do. I resigned myself to a sleepless night and continued trying to read. Eventually, I fell asleep with the light on and the book on my chest. The last time I looked at the clock, it was around 4 a.m. When I woke up, the feeling was gone. The house felt normal again. I called in sick to work and slept until noon. Later, while cleaning out a filing cabinet, I received a phone call from a woman informing me that my friend Richard had passed away the previous afternoon. Richard and I had been college friends, but we had drifted apart. Hearing about his death, I immediately knew it had been Richard's presence I felt that night. It all made sense. The feeling of being watched without malice, just an intense presence. Richard had come to say goodbye. Since then, I've never had another experience like that in my house. I grew up in a mobile home in rural Ohio, USA. My closest neighbors were my stepfamily down the road. I lived with my mom and stepdad and saw my biological father only every other weekend, with a 30-minute drive to the pickup/drop-off point. One summer day, my stepdad was at work, and my mom, annoyed with my brother and me for arguing over the TV, sent us to clean our rooms. My brother's room and mine were next to each other at one end of the mobile home, while my mom and stepdad's room was at the opposite end. We were familiar with each other's footsteps in the house. I had a large toy chest my stepdad made for me, taking up half of a small wall in my room, and I was sitting on the floor, a few feet away from both the chest and the door. I got distracted while cleaning, playing with a Barbie doll I found. About 15 minutes passed when I saw movement near my door out of the corner of my eye. Startled, I initially thought my brother was messing with me, as I hadn't heard my mom's distinctive footsteps. But when I looked, it wasn't my brother. I stopped breathing. Standing in front of my bedroom door was a man who looked like my biological father, dressed in late 80s/early 90s clothing, but with a mullet and mustache. Logically, I knew it wasn't my dad. He lived an hour away and wasn't visiting that weekend. Also, my dad always had a shaved head. The terrifying part was that this man, who looked so much like my father, was holding his decapitated head in his right hand, as if using it like a lantern in broad daylight. His face had a cruel smile despite being detached from his body. I stared at him, frozen in shock, for about 10 seconds, unable to scream or move. I finally squeezed my eyes shut and whispered to myself that he wasn't there. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. My mom checked on us about 10 minutes later, finding me still staring at the spot where the man had stood. She asked if I was okay, noticing my blank expression, but I brushed it off. I never saw the man again and never mentioned it to anyone until now. It's one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, and I still think about it frequently. Do you think this could have been a ghost encounter from my childhood? My husband died by suicide in June, which sent me into a deep spiral. I'm only now starting to recover. To give some context, I have faced depression and suicidal thoughts before he passed, and have been on medication for it for about 3 years. He knew how to calm my anxiety attacks and was a crucial part of my support system. For about 2 weeks after he passed, I felt his presence. I would talk to him like I did when he was alive, and it helped me cope. These conversations, whether imagined or real, provided comfort. Then, around mid-July, he wasn't there anymore. This hurt, but I understood it as part of the healing process, or maybe he had moved on. Either way, I stopped talking out loud because I felt alone. I still talk to him when I visit his grave. It helps me feel better. The grave is still unmarked, which bothers me, but I try to leave fresh flowers and scatter the petals of the previous ones. It's a small gesture, but it's something. He is buried in a very small cemetery, surrounded by cornfields. The lawn is not maintained, which I appreciate because it feels natural. He is close to nature, as much as one can be within cemetery requirements. Late last month or early this month, I was visiting him, just talking. I told him that things weren't going well. I felt overwhelmed and stressed from work. As I stood there in silence, not wanting to leave on a negative note, I felt something change. The air seemed to stop. It was like I was in my own bubble. Nebraska is always windy, but I couldn't hear the corn rustling or the wind chimes marking his grave. I held my breath, not out of fear or panic, but in awe. I got goosebumps and started to tear up. It was him. He was there with me in the silence. I said, "Oh, hi. Okay, you're here. Oh," through my tears. I knew he was sorry for making me cry, so I reassured him that it was only because he surprised me. Then my emotions shifted, and I started to laugh. A happy cry laugh. I told him I was sorry for waking him up and that I missed him. I assured him I wasn't going to do anything drastic. I was just feeling really down. But with him there, I felt better. I would be okay. The sounds of the corn rustling returned, and I felt him fading. I told him to go back to rest, that I loved him and was grateful to feel his presence again. I left the cemetery feeling uplifted, still chuckling. I was very skeptical of ghosts and spirits before this, and still am for the most part, but that moment in the cemetery was different. He hasn't appeared since, and I'm not going to push it because I believe it took a lot for him to come to me. It was just so comforting. I don't believe in the traditional ideas of heaven or hell, but more in the concept of peace and rest. I wanted to share this experience to see if anyone else has had something similar and maybe can explain it better. Hi, my name is Nevaeh, and my parents' house is haunted. I, 20F, recently moved back into my parents' home in North Carolina due to some personal issues. North Carolina is known for its haunted locations, and the house my parents moved into is an 8-bedroom house with a basement. The only history I know is that a doctor lived here before us, which is quite eerie. Why would one person need 8 bedrooms? Another unsettling detail is that all the doors had slide locks on the outside, and you can still see the holes where they were screwed in. Now, for the ghostly experiences. My siblings and I have had numerous encounters. My brother Shadon, 17M, had a spooky experience in the basement, which has its own door leading outside. You walk out the door and go up the stairs on your left, and this stairway has a roof at ground level. Shadon was standing under it when he heard 2 footsteps above. When he checked, no one was there. My sister Amarie, 15F, has also had strange experiences. Our backyard has a shed with a motion sensor light that frequently goes off at night. She has heard noises around the house, and the creepy part is that her window is right above the platform where Shadon heard the footsteps. As for me, Nevaeh, 20F, I've heard whispering in the middle of the night, and once, something ran up the stairs at me, startling the cat. Even now, as I write this, I feel like I'm being watched. My younger brother Adnija, 10M, has had disturbing dreams about our mom, my stepmom, sitting in the corner of his room, looking at the ceiling and calling his name. My stepmom, 35F, saw an apparition at the end of her bed and had a dream the next night where a ghost told her it wasn't there to harm us. I thought you might find these experiences interesting. Edit. I almost forgot this one. Shadon was playing hide and seek with our other siblings when he heard a knock and looked through the peephole of our front door. He saw someone walking down the steps who he didn't recognize. When he ran outside, he saw our dad and said, "I saw you. You can't trick me." Our dad replied, "I've been sitting here the whole time. I haven't moved." Given the direction the person walked, Our dad would have seen them if they were coming around the house or running away. My friends and I, who I'll call A, E, S, and D when needed, have been dabbling in paranormal investigations for the past few years. We're not professionals and don't claim to be. It's just something we enjoy whenever we get together. We visited a few haunted locations, but nothing prepared us for what happened in this story. One day, we were discussing our next investigation. We had just finished one a couple of nights before, so we were feeling quite brave. One of our friends suggested an old abandoned school in rural Tennessee, which we had heard about from YouTube videos and online searches. If you're familiar with the story of the boy who was bullied to death and buried under the floorboards, you'll know the school I mean. For those who don't know, here's a brief summary. A young boy was cornered in the school bathroom by a bully, who beat him so badly that he died on the spot. In a panic, the bully pulled up some floorboards with a pocket knife and hid the body underneath. Because of this brutal incident, it is said that a dark and malevolent spirit haunts the school, alongside the boy's spirit. Some speculate that this dark spirit might have driven the bully to such violence. Unfortunately, I couldn't join us on this trip, so I invited another friend, H. H wasn't really into the paranormal, but agreed to come along just to hang out. We set off to the school, hoping for some paranormal experiences and maybe even some evidence to share online. When we arrived, we quickly realized that the pictures and videos we had seen didn't do the place justice. It was truly creepy. The building was covered in vines, graffiti, and shrubbery. The windows were busted out, and the doors were off their hinges. As we explored, we found the entrance to the basement, a place you're supposedly not supposed to go, especially the boiler room. Naturally, we wanted to go there first. The basement was filled with broken equipment, graffiti, trash, and a random school chair in the corner. E joked, "This must not be a very powerful spirit if this is where it has to live." We all chuckled and continued exploring, but in hindsight, that probably wasn't the best comment to make. We then moved to the main area of the school, which was in even worse condition. After exploring some classrooms, the gym, and the bathroom where the boy was supposedly buried, we decided to start our investigation. We set up cameras, motion sensor lights, and voice recorders. 3 of us were in a classroom, playing with dowsing rods and a spirit box, while H and I were in the hall. As H and I stared down the hall, we heard a loud bang from what we assumed was a staircase. We shined our lights but saw nothing and assumed it was an animal. Eventually, I joined the others in the classroom while H stayed in the hall. H suddenly looked ghostly white and said he saw someone poke their head around the corner and look right at him. We tried to reassure him that it was just his mind playing tricks, but he was insistent. Spooked, we decided to move to another area. As we talked about our next move, we heard a child's laugh from the classroom we had just left. We froze. S asked, "What was that?" E built up the courage to investigate, but something told me it wasn't safe. I grabbed his arm, but he brushed me off and went in. A moment later, we heard a loud crash. The floor had collapsed right where we had been standing. Had E gone in, he could have been seriously hurt or worse. Shaken, we decided to go to the gym, thinking it might be safer. I started using the dowsing rods and asked, "Can you point to where you are?" The rods pointed to a dark corner of the gym. "Guys, come here," I called out. As my friends approached, the rods started following E. It seemed like he was being targeted. We asked, "Are you mad at him?" And the rods went unnaturally still. Suddenly, I felt something strong grab the rods and thrash them around. Noises started coming from all over the school. Doors slamming, things being thrown, and screams. H pointed to the dark corner and let out a terrifying scream. We didn't wait to see what he saw. We grabbed our stuff and ran. Back at my place, we finally calmed down enough to ask H what he had seen. He described a huge figure, about 7 feet tall, with long arms, devilish horns, and a wide, evil grin. Knowing that this thing was so close to us was chilling. We've never returned to that school and have no plans to. If that place was demolished and the rubble burned, it would be a favor to the world. If you know the school I'm talking about, stay away. That night will haunt us forever. When I was around 10 to 12 years old, I stayed at my cousin's house for a week. My cousin lives in a small rural area surrounded by farmland. One of those fields had a locked house, with every door and window secured except for the garage door, which was slightly open but not enough for us to squeeze through. We made the driveway our hangout spot since it was convenient for our friends to meet up. We often made up ghost stories and explored the backyard, which had a broken fence gate. The backyard had an old shed that was sealed shut and emitted a horrible smell that made some of us, including me, nauseous. One day, we decided to get inside the house. We couldn't get through the windows because we were too small, so we targeted the front door. Although the door was locked, it was old and the lock looked busted. We spent 2 days kicking, throwing things, and slamming our bodies against it until we managed to break it enough to squeeze in. Inside, we began exploring, hoping to find something cool or spooky. I eventually separated from my friends and my cousin and entered a room with peeling wallpaper, a broken fan and light on the floor, and a stuck door. The closet had a cracked mirror on it. The only furniture in the room was a wooden rocking chair that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. It became a joke in our group. Whoever dared to sit in it would be possessed, just dumb kid stuff. Despite the jokes, the chair gave me an unsettling feeling, like I was in another universe. After a bit of exploring, we decided to head home at sunset to avoid worrying our parents. On the way, my cousin suddenly stopped, sent a text, and turned back, saying she had left something in the house. I didn't like the idea but followed her because I didn't know the way home. As we approached the house, I saw a figure in one of the windows. It didn't have eyes, but when I pointed it out, it disappeared. Spooked, I didn't want to stay outside alone, so I followed her inside. Once inside, the feeling of being watched intensified. My cousin felt it too. She wanted to take a picture of the chair, and as we headed to that room, we heard the sound of nails scraping on the walls, getting closer. After she took the picture, we turned to leave, and I saw the same black figure again, this time with pitch black eyes like staring into a void. My cousin saw it too and panicked. Her phone light went out, and we heard running footsteps coming from the direction of the figure. We bolted out of there as fast as we could, feeling like we were running for ages. Once outside, we sprinted home, desperate to get away. The ordeal didn't end there. I kept having nightmares, and whenever we looked out the window in my cousin's room, which faced the fields, we saw the same figure with black eyes staring at us. After a while, the sightings and nightmares stopped, but the experience left a lasting impression. It might sound silly, and it could have all been tricks of our minds and eyes, but it truly creeped me out. When I think of that place now, most details are a blur, but that room and that eerie chair are still vividly clear in my memory. This happened around 9 or 10 years ago. I used to live in an older house located in a small neighborhood where all the houses looked exactly the same, each with 2 floors. On the first floor of our house was a pizzeria, and we lived on the second floor. This detail becomes important later. A lot of strange and unusual things happened in that house, leading us to believe it was haunted. Items would go missing and then reappear hours or days later in places they shouldn't be. We would hear sounds of someone running in the attic. My dad would always check for rats or cats, but never found anything. Doors would close by themselves, and cold air would appear out of nowhere. I used to wake up with scratches on my wrists and legs in the same places every day. You might think I scratched myself while sleeping, but the odd thing is, after we moved out of the house, I never woke up with scratches again. After we closed down the pizzeria, we hardly used it except for parties or later as storage. Everyone I knew felt scared or uncomfortable being in the pizzeria. They would say it was too cold, too quiet, and some, including me, felt like someone was constantly watching them. I had 2 dogs and multiple cats, and every animal seemed absolutely terrified of going down there. My oldest dog would stay in front of the pizzeria entrance, growling and barking. The cats would dash past it as quickly as possible. Even today, I hear new scary stories from my family or people who visited us back then. 2 stories, in particular, really scared me. One day, I was playing hide and seek upstairs with 2 friends, and see. There were about 3 good hiding spots. One between the couch and a small sofa chair in the living room, another behind a different sofa, and the third one under a table in my parents' bedroom. It was Cia's turn to search for us. At one point, she looked behind the sofa and saw someone with their back facing her. She called out to M, but M emerged from a different hiding place. Seeing this, C got really scared and started crying. We decided to stop the game and leave the house. At first, I didn't believe C, but when M said she saw something behind the sofa too, I started to question things. Another story, which not many people believe, happened when I was home alone. I was getting ready to be picked up by a family friend. As I was getting out of the bathroom, which was at the end of the hallway, I noticed it was quite sunny that day. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a tall black shadow pass by me really fast. It scared me because the light was shining in front of me, so my shadow should have been behind me, not next to me. Plus, it suddenly got really cold. I ran out of the house as fast as I could. Not long after that, we moved, and nothing strange happened again. I later heard from our neighbors that someone had died in the house before we moved in. Do you think it could have been a ghost or maybe an evil spirit? In my mid-20s, I worked at a subacute rehab facility. These places help individuals recovering from accidents, surgeries, or other conditions regain their mobility and quality of life through physical therapy and around-the-clock nursing care. I worked in the dementia unit, which housed long-term patients with various brain-related conditions, including dementia, Alzheimer's, comas, strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and brain tumors. Here are some of the experiences I had while working there. A disembodied hand. One evening, shortly after clocking in, I was reviewing notes from the day shift nurse. I stood at the end of the hallway with my back against the wall. As I read over my notes, I felt what seemed like a hand dragging its fingers across my abdomen. I jerked back and looked around, but I was completely alone. The call light symphony. Call lights in empty rooms often turned on by themselves, even in rooms where the wires were unplugged from the wall. Some nights, nurses had to respond to several phantom calls from these empty rooms. The empty room ghost. At the end of one hallway was a perpetually empty room. The heating and air conditioning unit was broken, so no patients were ever placed there. Nurses and aides used it for privacy during personal phone calls or to take a moment alone. One evening, I went into that room's bathroom to touch up my makeup. I left the bathroom door slightly ajar. As I was fixing my hair, the bathroom door suddenly slammed shut behind me. My heart raced as I spun around and quickly opened the door. The room was empty, and there was no furniture for anyone to hide behind. I am convinced it wasn't a living person who shut that door. The last farewell. One patient in the long-term unit was a middle-aged woman with severe Down syndrome. She was mostly nonverbal but very sweet, always smiling. One night, I was helping her eat dinner while we watched cartoons on her TV. Suddenly, she started acting out of character, trying to get my attention. She pointed excitedly at an empty corner of her room, giggling and waving at seemingly nothing. I tried to understand what she was seeing, but there was nothing there. After feeding her, I stepped into the hallway and was immediately approached by another nurse. She told me that the woman's next-door neighbor had passed away during dinner time. The window watcher. This story was told to me by a fellow nurse. My friend Mary, not her real name, worked the night shift at the same rehab facility. She was close to one of her patients, an elderly woman named Emily, who had no living family and was chronically lonely. Emily would wait by her room's window, which faced the employee parking lot, to wave at Mary when she arrived and left work. When Emily fell ill and couldn't get out of bed, Mary would check the window as she walked to work, hoping to see her. This went on for a few weeks. One day, Mary arrived at work and saw Emily standing at her window. Thrilled, Mary waved, but Emily did not respond. Mary headed inside, only to find out that Emily had passed away earlier that day. I hope you enjoyed these stories as much as I enjoy sharing them. Growing up in the 1970s, my family employed a maid, which was a common practice at the time. Many black women would take the bus to the suburbs to work for upper-middle-class white families. Becky, who had been with our family since the early 1960s, was one such maid. She also worked for my grandparents. I often saw my grandfather waiting for Becky at the corner bus stop when I was on my way to school. Becky was like a member of our family. She worked for my grandparents 2 days a week and for us 2 days a week. I always felt a bit envious of the third family she worked for on the remaining day. My name is Rebecca, and I was supposed to be called Becky, but to avoid confusion with our Becky, I was always called Rebecca. Becky was a kind and gentle soul. She would leave candy under our pillows, neatly organize any coins or money she found in our clothes, and give us gifts at Christmas. Becky and her adult nieces, Linda and Sylvia, would babysit us when our parents were on vacation. Once, I got to visit Becky's apartment downtown. It was a nice place in a safe building where elderly people lived. She lived on a high floor, perhaps the 10th. What struck me was that she had every single school photo of me and my 2 sisters framed and hanging on her wall. It was clear that we were her family, too. When I was 14, my parents separated, and my mother was devastated. Becky, having gone through a similar experience, comforted my mother. Becky was our rock, especially during this difficult time when both my grandparents had recently passed away. In the summer of 1980, after returning from summer camp, my little sister found Becky unresponsive. She had suffered a stroke and passed away later that day in the hospital. Despite spending more time with us than her own family, we weren't allowed to see her because we weren't family. After Becky's passing, my mother started going out more, and I had to babysit my sister. While babysitting, I often heard noises upstairs, like footsteps, even though our dog and my sister were asleep. My mother didn't believe me. My parents briefly reconciled, and one night, I heard a strange wailing sound coming from the attic. The next morning, my dad mentioned hearing it too, but despite setting traps, no animals were found. After my parents split for good, I continued to hear footsteps when alone in the house. Years later, in 1992, I moved back in with my mother after separating from my husband. One day, while my boyfriend and I were in the living room, he heard footsteps and asked about them. I explained that I believed it was Becky watching over us. A few weeks later, during a romantic evening by the fire, my boyfriend saw a woman in a pink sweater walk by. I hadn't told him about Becky's pink cardigan, but I knew it was her. When I shared this with my mother, she finally believed me. I should mention that my father, grandmother, and sisters attended Becky's funeral, but my mother did not. At the funeral, Becky's family thought I was named after her. Although my mother had named me after Becky Thatcher from Tom Sawyer, I let them believe I was named after our Becky because it made them happy. They told me how much Becky loved us, something I already knew but was comforting to hear. My uncle used to work on the Great Lakes freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, which transported iron ore and limestone across the Great Lakes. One evening in November 2007, around 7 p.m., they were crossing Lake Superior en route to Cleveland, Ohio, when they began receiving distress calls on their radio. The calls claimed to be from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald famously sank in 1975, taking all 29 crew members with it. Initially, the crew thought it was a distasteful prank. However, when they checked the radar, they found no other ships within 70 nautical miles, even though their radio's range was only 60 nautical miles. The voice on the radio described a heavy storm and high winds, expressing genuine fear. But the weather outside was calm, and the night was clear. At around 8 p.m., the distress calls abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence. The radio remained quiet for the rest of the night. No one could sleep, haunted by the experience. There's an unsettling irony in this event. Not only was my uncle on the SS Arthur M. Anderson, the sister ship to the Edmund Fitzgerald, but it was also the last ship to make contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975 when it sank. Did my uncle and his shipmates actually make contact with the ghosts of the Edmund Fitzgerald crew? Or is there another explanation? We'll never know. but it's one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. I'm from Australia, and I used to work at a 24/7 rural petrol station in a small town called Barham. It's on the Murray River, and if you ask any local, they'll have a spooky story to tell. When I started the job, I was warned about shadows seen on the security cameras. These cameras were always recording, and you could watch them on a small TV behind the counter. My boss told me that shadows would appear around the petrol pumps, and sometimes the lights would go out over the pumps. He said to ignore it, and if I wanted, I could stay in the back room until a customer came in. When I asked why, he replied in a typical Aussie way, "Because they aren't customers, they aren't your friends, and bad things happen if you acknowledge them." With that advice, I started my first graveyard shift. They put someone else on the shift with me since I was new, but that didn't prepare me for the night. Around 2 a.m., things started to get weird. The fridge lights flickered, the radio went in and out of static, but the most unsettling thing was watching a figure on the cameras moving back and forth at the edge of the lights by the pumps, beyond which was just pitch black road. The other worker, Tony, could see it too and tried to ignore it, probably to keep me from being too spooked. What was strange was that when car headlights shone onto the road where the figure was pacing, it vanished, confirming it wasn't physical. When the car owner finished filling up and came to pay, he mentioned, "Just had my first experience of a ghost car. I saw its tail lights and then suddenly gone. Creepy stuff out in the bush tonight." That was an understatement. I quit the job after 4 days because I couldn't handle another night shift there. It was a wild experience. A few months later, I went to a mate's house for a bonfire on his parents' property. It was mid-July, so a cold night. In a small town, it's common to know everyone, especially teenagers. So, it was no surprise to see Tony from the petrol station at the gathering. I knew I had to ask him about that night. We got to talking, and I remember him saying, "You got out of that place at the right time." I asked why. He said, "One of them managed to speak. I saw the shadow pacing, but then it started to call my name." Tony looked really uncomfortable and teary-eyed when he said, "It sounded like my mom. She passed away when I was 12. He struggled to continue. It showed up every night after that using the same voice, asking me to come outside. I quit about 2 weeks after you did because of that, and I still can't get the voice out of my head. It sounded like my mom, but it was way too sinister." When he said that, I felt a chill. Even if it wasn't a paranormal encounter, whatever Tony heard or saw really got to him. After that, a few more of us joined the conversation. We talked about our encounters and other things we saw out in the bush. I now live in Mean/Brisbane. City life is completely different, but the paranormal doesn't stop. Ever since that night, I've been fascinated by the paranormal and started exploring it. I learned quickly that most paranormal activity can be explained, but I do have a few stories that remain unexplained. Barham will always be the most haunted place I've ever lived. I'm convinced the land is haunted there. I'm going back this winter, back to the petrol station, to see if I can capture this encounter again. I first posted this in Glitch in the Matrix, but it might fit better here. This happened when I was just a kid, around 9 or 10 years old. Although it sounds like a made-up story, it really did happen. This is my first time revealing it since that day. I grew up on a farm, where chores and helping out were a regular part of life. If you know anything about farming, you know that hay baling is an all-hands-on-deck time. You're bucking bales in the field and sweating it out in the hayloft during some of the hottest days of the year. After a long day of putting up bales, covered in sweat, with hay sticking to us and in our mouths and noses, we were finally done. As true country kids, when that last bale hit the hayloft, my siblings and I ran towards the pond like it was an oasis in the desert. We hit the cool water at full speed. Our pond was spring-fed by an underground river, so the water was always around 60 degrees. We were splashing around, enjoying getting the sweat and hay off of us. All of a sudden, everything in my mind froze. It was as if time had stopped. There was no sound. The shouts and laughter had ceased. I could move my eyes, but not my head. I glanced around as much as possible. I saw my brother doing a cannonball from the shore. He was frozen just as his lower half had entered the water. I could see the water bursting around him, frozen in midair. I could see the happiness on his face. I also saw my other brother stepping up onto the shore, with water dripping from him, frozen in midair. Just beyond my brother, standing on the shore, was a robed figure holding a sickle. Beside him was an old man who looked a lot like my dad. The old man was using a walker or two canes, though I don't remember exactly. There was something so familiar yet different about this old man. I looked closer and realized the old man resembled my dad. But it wasn't him. The old man was talking to the figure in the dark robe and looking at me. I had no idea what was being said, and I was internally freaking out. Time had stopped, and there were two figures standing on the bank of the pond. One definitely looked like the Grim Reaper, and I was acutely aware of them. In that instant, I sensed the old man was trying to decide if he could jump into my body fast enough to escape his guardian. He decided not to try. In the next instant, they disappeared, and the world started again. I started freaking out, asking my brothers what just happened. I explained that time had just frozen and told them about the two figures on the shore. They looked at me with that look brothers give each other when they think one of them is nuts. I never mentioned this again to anyone. It's now almost 50 years later. Guess what? I look like my dad did. I also have severe neuropathy in both legs and should be using a cane or walker. But I flat out refuse to use them, no matter how bad the pain is. I now know the second figure on the shore was me as an old man. I now know the Grim Reaper was reviewing my life with me. I also know that for that one moment in time, young me and old me were aware of each other. That's why I knew what that old guy was thinking. I also know old me didn't want to deprive young me of my future by trying to jump into my body. When the time comes and current me is on that shore looking at young me, I hope I am smart enough to tell myself to make some wise investments. Most will probably think this is a made-up tale, but I assure you it really happened. I saw my future self standing beside the Grim Reaper, watching my younger self. First, a bit of background on the hospital. It was initially constructed during World War II as a temporary facility. However, instead of being dismantled after the war, it was further built upon and modernized over the years. Despite these updates, some parts of the hospital retain their original eerie architecture. This mix of old and new gives the building a unique, yet unsettling atmosphere, perfect for a ghost story. It was a particularly cold winter night, and I was on the night shift. Everything was running smoothly until around 2 or 3 in the morning. At that time, a patient was admitted to our ward with an infection. This patient had no cognitive impairments such as dementia or learning difficulties, so there was no reason to expect anything unusual from them. Suddenly, the tranquility of the night was shattered by a blood-curdling scream coming from the side room where the patient was staying. Myself and another nurse rushed to the room to see what was going on. As we entered, the patient was visibly terrified, screaming about a man with a bag over his head, who had been standing at the end of her bed. Watching her, we immediately tried to calm the patient down, reassuring her that there was no one else in the room. But as I was speaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a palpable shift in the room's energy, something I couldn't quite explain. Despite my attempts to soothe the patient, I couldn't deny the eerie feeling creeping over me. After a few minutes, we managed to settle the patient down. As the other nurse and I turned to leave the room, we both froze. Outside the side room, through a set of double doors in an alcove, we saw a shadowy figure pass by. The doors were always locked and required a key to open. It took us a moment to process what we had just seen. We quickly realized that the time it took for us to see the figure and how long it would take to unlock, walk through, and then lock the doors again was impossible. There was no way anyone could have done that in the split second we saw the shadow. Both of us came to the unsettling conclusion that what we had witnessed was not of this world. Feeling unnerved, we returned to the nurse's station, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This hospital has a fair share of ghost stories, and this experience was just one of 3 I've had personally during my 5-year tenure there. The hospital's history as a World War II temporary facility only adds to its spooky reputation. Many of my colleagues have had their own encounters, ranging from seeing apparitions to hearing unexplained noises that, in fact, I can recall another time when I was working a night shift, and the sound of footsteps echoed in an empty corridor. Another colleague reported seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothing roaming the halls late at night. Each story adds another layer to the haunted history of the hospital. I work as a cleaner at a therapist's office. Most of the time, the office feels just fine, but every once in a while, something feels off. I usually prefer not to work alone in the office. There are several rooms that must be locked at all times when not in use because they contain expensive equipment. My most unsettling experience happened on the only day I went to clean alone, and it was in the middle of the day. I decided to quickly go to the office to clean before heading to a school activity. When I arrived, the lights were on, and the front door was unlocked, so I naturally assumed that a therapist was there. I hurriedly went through my cleaning routine downstairs, making sure that all the doors were securely locked behind me when I finished in each room. However, when I started to clean upstairs, I realized I was all alone in the office. I called my mom to let her know I was alone, but reassured her that the front door was locked. My mom is a therapist at this office, and she later told me that it wasn't the living people she was wary of. The moment I got off the phone with my mom, I heard a loud pop and creak downstairs. My heart dropped, and I started to panic because I knew that was the sound of one of the locked doors opening. I froze, listening for a moment. I quickly video called my mom to gather the courage I needed to go downstairs and check out what happened. When you walk down the stairs, there is a small landing where you turn right to go down the rest of the stairs. The stairs lead to a room straight ahead and rooms to the right and left. The door directly in front of the stairs was wide open. Needless to say, I was terrified. What if someone was in there, or worse, what if no one was in there? My mom watched on my phone as I slowly walked into the room and looked around. No one was there. My mom, who was about an hour away, told me to hurry and call a friend to come over and be with me as I cleaned the rest of the office. When I got back upstairs, I called a friend and decided to sit in the waiting room until he arrived. While I waited, I heard a loud, raspy breath like someone slowly exhaling just behind me at the top of the stairs. The instant I heard that, I jumped out of my chair and ran out of the building. When my friend showed up, we checked the whole office together just to make sure no one was there, even though I knew no living person could have come through the front door without passing by me first. I'm a nurse in a palliative care unit at an old hospital. If you work in a similar setting or know someone who does, please listen to this story. I could use your help. Throughout my years working here, I've seen a lot. Being in a palliative care unit, you encounter things others might wish they hadn't. For some of us, at some point, we just have to accept things as they are. The unit I work in has 9 beds in 9 different rooms, all spread along a long corridor. At the start of the corridor is the elevator. On the right is the cleaning room where we keep all the cleaning supplies, and on the left is the nurse's room and the entrance through the stairs. For safety and convenience, the administration doesn't allow us to lock the stair doors. This isn't ideal because some of our patients, in their confusion, can wander unnoticed and put themselves in danger. To prevent this, we tie a bed sheet around the door handles to keep them closed. This detail is important for what comes next. The nurse's room is where we spend most of our night shifts doing various activities, including resting. Late at night, my routine includes checking on all our patients, making sure all the doors and windows are securely locked, and then spending most of the night reviewing patient files. One particular night, I had finished my rounds and was checking the cameras. My nursing assistant came into the room and asked if she could sleep for a while. I told her it was fine, so she took off her shoes, laid down with her back to the room, and went to sleep. I was reading a new patient's file when I started hearing footsteps in the corridor. At first, I ignored them, thinking I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the footsteps persisted, walking up and down the corridor. I checked the cameras again, but everything seemed normal. The steps, though, kept coming closer to the nurse's room, stopping just a couple of steps away before turning around and walking back to the opposite end. Curious, I stood up to check. Just then, One of our patients in room number 7 started calling out frantically. My assistant was still asleep, so I walked carefully out of the room and looked around. There was nothing there, and the footsteps had stopped, so I rushed to the patient's room. When I got there, he was shouting and huddling against the bed's headboard, yelling at me to tell the man in the top hat sitting on the chair to go away. To calm him down, I pretended to talk to this imaginary man, telling him he needed to leave. The patient thanked me and lay back down to rest. I went back to the nurse's room, my heart pounding. As I checked the surveillance cameras again, I saw a large shadow standing in the frame of the camera recording the end of the corridor, right in front of the bedroom I had just been in. I looked down the corridor, but saw nothing. When I glanced back at the cameras, the shadow was still there. This time, when I looked directly at the corridor, I saw it. For a moment, everything froze. The shadow turned towards me, revealing dark red eyes. It screeched and flew into the patient's room, slamming the door behind it. My assistant woke up at the sound and asked what was happening. I told her what I had seen, and though she was skeptical, she agreed to come with me to check the room. As we approached, a breath of freezing air hit me when I opened the door. The air conditioning was on, but this cold was abnormal. Inside, the shadow of a man in a top hat stood by the patient's bed. I asked my assistant if she could see it, but she couldn't. Slowly, the shadow turned towards me and dissipated. Immediately, I felt a sense of calm, and the patient seemed fine, so we left the room and returned to the nurse's room. My colleague went back to sleep, but I stayed up, checking the unit to ensure everyone was safe. The next day, during my rounds, I discovered the patient in room 7 had passed away. This was my first experience with the shadow man in the top hat, but it wasn't the last. I'm the only one who can see him, which unsettles everyone. Every time I see him, it's the same. He stands at the foot of a patient's bed, turns to me, and dissipates. 1 or 2 days later, the patient passes away. This is something I live with almost every day now. I'm not sure if this presence is causing the deaths or foretelling them. If you are a nurse or know someone who is, please share this story and let me know if you have experienced anything similar. I need to understand what this is and how to deal with it. If there's anyone else out there with similar experiences, even with a different entity, please let me know. Sharing this might help us feel less alone and less afraid. My house has a spirit named Marie. Here's a little background on how we first became aware of her and discovered why she might be attached to the property. Our home is designed in the American Foursquare style, which you could describe as an expanded bungalow. While most true bungalows are 1.5 stories, ours is 2.5, plus a full basement. It's a nice, middle-class home of its time, originally costing $4,000 to build. Like many homes in our part of Chicago, it has a connection to the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, now Metra, as its first owner was a railroad conductor. However, he and his family didn't stay long. In 1916, they sold the home to a woman, whose name I've unfortunately forgotten, who stayed until 1926. The next owner was Marie, Mrs. Marie Britt, a married mother of 4 and a grammar school teacher. I don't know much about Mr. Britt except that he was a printer by trade and that his name wasn't on the deed, which was unusual for that era. After learning from census records that the couple was still together in 1940, I concluded that his omission from the document wasn't due to marital discord. Instead, it seemed Marie wanted to ensure the house remained in her name only, possibly because she purchased it with money from an inheritance. Wanting to maintain sole ownership was very forward-thinking for 1926, but perhaps in keeping with a woman who had graduated college and continued her career after marriage. When my husband and I first bought the house, we knew none of this. We just knew the place was affordable because it needed work. Our top priority was overhauling the only full bathroom, which featured a broken toilet, a sink that wasn't up to code, and a clawfoot tub oddly encased in tile. The contractors told us it would take 3 to 4 weeks to make it functional, meaning we couldn't move in right away. Thankfully, our landlord agreed to extend our apartment lease, so we had somewhere to stay. Since I was employed part-time, I took on the second job of supervising the work on the house. Every chance I got, I'd pack a lunch and head over to spend a few hours watching new electric lines being installed, tile being laid, and so on. Due to it being August, with the new central air system not yet installed, this wasn't very enjoyable, but it gave me time to familiarize myself with the house, which at 2,800 plus square foot was much bigger than anything I'd ever lived in. One day, while making my rounds, I got a distinct feeling someone was accompanying me. I felt their presence as I assessed the empty rooms on the second floor, envisioning which would be our bedroom, which our home office, etc. Unafraid of spirits, I eventually asked, "Who are you? Can you tell me your name?" And the answer came whispered, "Marie." At first, I was skeptical about where the name had come from, since my own middle name is Marie, in honor of my father's sister. Could my subconscious have been throwing something familiar back at me? To answer that question, I did some research at City Hall, where records of deed transfers are kept. To trust my psychic sense, I needed a foundation, in fact. Finding Marie's name among the prior owners, she was the only one with that first name, elated me. I soon dedicated myself to following her paper trail, looking up census records, obituaries, and more. The more I found, the more real she became, and the more I liked her. I began noticing little things around the house that spoke to her residency, such as an old, wall-mounted schoolroom-type pencil sharpener dating to the 1920s 30s. Next, I discovered a notation on the bottom of a kitchen drawer that read, "Fix this, June 1936. She did a pretty good job, considering the repair lasted about 60 years before we had to do it again. After 2 years of ownership, I was finding evidence of Marie everywhere, but I had nothing besides hearing her whispered name to indicate she was still present. Would she ever show herself in a way that confirmed her ongoing existence? Well, she did, but not to my husband or me. Instead, she appeared to Jim, a police officer moonlighting as a carpenter, whom we'd hired to replace some would trim and rehang a door. Working nights in a busy precinct, Jim was not a guy given to flights of fancy. Yet one day when we arrived home, he had quite a story to share. He told us that while on his knees installing baseboard, he'd looked up for a moment and seen a woman dressed in 1920s attire coming down the stairs. After briefly regarding his work, she vanished, making him feel he'd gotten her seal of approval. Later, I would sense, but not see, Marie on those same stairs when she literally passed through me as I went up and she went down. That experience is hard to describe, except to say she felt cold and tingly going through, like a couple hundred low-voltage electrical shocks happening at once. Our stairs are uncarpeted, so my experience wasn't due to static. After nearly 3 decades in this house, we now have a collection of Marie's stories, proving her continued presence and establishing that she's a protective spirit, still looking after her house 97 years after she purchased it.